They called her father paranoid. He was preparing for war. Jules returned to her childhood town in the Oregon mountains under a sky heavy with clouds, the air crisp with pine and fog. The house she had inherited from her father loomed over the valley, its weathered wooden siding streaked with years of rain, its windows reflecting nothing but shadows. Every step she took along the gravel driveway echoed memories she had tried to bury, long afternoons of loneliness, the sting of small-town judgment, the constant whisper that her father had been strange, even dangerous in the eyes of the locals. She paused at the gate, noticing how the hinges creaked differently now, how the wind seemed to carry a chill that wasn't just from the mountains. It was as if the property itself was aware she had returned. Her hands hovered over the latch, uncertain for the first time since leaving Chicago. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of cedar and old paper. Jules set down her suitcase, the thud echoing through the hollow house like a gunshot. This place wasn't just neglected, it was waiting. She ran her hand over the heavy oak mantel, her fingers finding the rhythmic notches her father had carved, not as decoration, but as a tactile tally of days spent in watch. The weight of his isolation settled over her, more oppressive than the dust. The town outside was silent, unusual for a place that had once buzzed with gossip and routine. As she stepped onto the porch, she noticed movement in the distance, figures crossing the main road, pausing to watch her without speaking. She knew them in part, neighbors she had known as a child, but their expressions were unreadable, guarded. Jules' stomach tightened. The small, tight-knit community had not changed in warmth. If anything, its walls had grown higher. Elijah arrived soon after, boots crunching on the gravel. His presence was calm but deliberate, as if he measured each step before taking it. He had not expected her, but seemed unsurprised to see her nonetheless. "Back sooner than I thought," he said, voice low, controlled. There was no judgment, no small-town condescension, only observation. Jules tightened her grip on the porch railing. "I'm here to inventory the estate for liquidation," she said, her voice sounding thinner than she intended. She wanted to believe it was just about the market value and a quick exit to Chicago. Elijah didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the perimeter fence where the forest began its slow encroachment. "This house doesn't just change hands, Jules. It holds them," he said, his tone devoid of sentiment. "Selling it isn't a transaction here. It's a surrender of territory. You might think you're clearing out a house, but you're actually opening a vault Silas Miller has been trying to crack since before you left." By mid-afternoon, the inventory shifted from furniture to hardware. Jules followed a series of etched symbols on the floorboards that led to the property's perimeter. These weren't the eccentricities of a lonely man. They were tactical upgrades. She found low-profile vibration sensors buried beneath the gravel and a series of concealed camera housings built into the birdhouses. Even the fence posts were reinforced with cold-rolled steel cores. Her father hadn't been hiding from the world. He had been monitoring it. The ranch wasn't a retirement retreat. It was an observation post designed to survive a siege at BY evening. The sky had darkened into shades of steel and violet, wind rustling through the pine needles. Jules set a fire in the old hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. She pulled her father's old photographs from a drawer, scanning faces that had once meant comfort and now only brought questions. Who had he protected? From what? And why had the truth been hidden until now? Elijah moved to stand behind her, hands resting lightly on the back of the chair, providing a silent reassurance. "You're not alone," he said. "Whatever's here, whatever you find, we face it together." Jules nodded, her mind a storm of fear, memory, and determination. For the first time since stepping off the bus, she felt the weight of choice pressing on her. Sell the property and forget, or dig deeper and uncover what her father had tried to protect. Outside, the mountains seemed to watch, patient, vast, indifferent to human fear or resolve. This was the beginning, not of closure, not of healing, but of confrontation, of the past, the town, and the hidden truths her father had left behind. The next morning, the mist didn't just hang. It tactically obscured the tree-line. Jules headed toward the garage, the keys to her father's old truck heavy in her pocket. She didn't walk to town. She drove, sensing the vastness of the perimeter she now inherited. Halfway down the access road, a patrol car drifted out of the gray, Its light bar dark, but its presence absolute. Elijah stepped out before she could brake, leaning against the hood of her vehicle. "The Millers have eyes on every trailhead, Jules," he said, tapping the glass. "They don't see a grieving daughter. They see a breach in their security." She rolled down the window, the engine idling roughly. "I'm not a breach, Elijah. I'm the owner, and I'm going to town to make sure everyone knows it." Elijah scanned the road behind her, his professional mask momentarily slipping. "Then settle it quickly. The Millers don't just watch. They curate the silence of this valley. If you break it, I can't guarantee which side of this uniform will have to respond when the calls start coming in." Jules's stomach tightened. She had expected awkward glances or whispers, but not this level of tension. The town had been patient, waiting. Perhaps even silent allies existed, but she couldn't rely on them. The moment she set foot on the main road, a subtle shift in attention rippled through the fogged streets. Shopkeepers straightened, children froze mid-step, conversations faltered. Every eye seemed to register her arrival. At the corner store, she filled her basket with essentials, keeping her movements deliberate, avoiding unnecessary interaction. Yet as she approached the counter, she noticed it. A subtle glance exchanged between two employees, lips barely moving, their eyes sharp. Something had changed since her arrival. She paid quickly, sensing a pattern in the nervous energy around her. Outside, Elijah waited, leaning against his car. He observed the town from a distance, his stance protective but relaxed. "They're watching," he said quietly. "Silas Miller's family has influence in every corner. Subtle, but effective. They make ordinary people wary of outsiders. You'll see it in small ways: hesitation, diverted gazes, false politeness." Jules exhaled, steadying herself. "Then we adapt. We don't give them easy leverage." She slid into the passenger seat, gripping the edge of the seat as the engine hummed to life. The town sprawled behind them, innocent on the surface but layered with hidden tensions, power structures she was only beginning to comprehend. Elijah started driving, navigating the winding roads back to the ranch. The forest closed around them again, muffling distant sounds, but the vigilance never left him. "There's more than observation happening here," he continued. "Your father left markers, details in the house, things only someone who knew him would find. He suspected attention like this, and he prepared for it. That's why the journal exists, and why you need to be deliberate, cautious, and precise." Jules nodded, the reality sinking in. Her father had anticipated resistance, manipulation, the subtle reach of powerful figures. His legacy was not merely a house or land. It was preparation, strategy, a map of threats and countermeasures. By the time they returned, shadows were stretching across the property, golden light fading into muted grays. Jules set the supplies down and stepped outside, surveying the land from the porch. Every fence post, tree, and path now seemed imbued with significance. She realized that surviving this town, surviving the Millers' influence, would require more than courage. It would require awareness, intelligence, and patience. Elijah joined her silently, and for a moment, they both watched the forest edge where shadows deepened. "The first moves are subtle," he said finally, "but the game is underway. We can't see everything yet, but we can prepare." Jules felt a determination solidifying inside her. She had returned to escape her past, but now she understood. Running was no longer an option. The town, the property, her father's legacy, they demanded confrontation, vigilance, and resolve. Whatever awaited them, they would face it with eyes open, ready to counter every subtle threat before it escalated. Night descended over the mountains, the wind rustling through the pines with an uneasy cadence. Jules sat at the kitchen table, the journal open before her. The entries were meticulous, chronicling her father's observations. Unmarked paths through the forest, unusual deliveries, subtle movements in town. Each line revealed a man consumed with vigilance, a father determined to preserve truth in a place where deception was woven into daily life. Elijah moved quietly behind her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He placed one beside her and leaned against the counter, scanning the dimly lit room. "Every detail matters," he said softly. He tracked more than the Miller's business. He tracked patterns, behaviors, routines. He left a blueprint for navigating this, for staying ahead. Jules traced a finger across a series of symbols and shorthand notations. She realized her father had mapped more than geography. He had mapped risk. Every path, every neighbor, every seemingly innocuous activity was recorded with a purpose. He knew, she whispered. He knew they would try to control everything, even after he was gone. The house creaked under the weight of the wind, a reminder that isolation amplified vulnerability. Jules felt a shiver, but pushed it aside. Fear had been her companion since she returned, but now it was tempered with understanding. Knowledge was power, and the journal provided both. Suddenly, a faint sound drew their attention. The crunch of gravel outside. Careful, deliberate. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Visitors, he muttered. Or scouts. Either way, someone is testing boundaries. He moved to the window, peering through the shadows. Two figures slipped across the edge of the property, remaining mostly hidden but deliberate in movement. Jules' pulse quickened. They're looking for me, she said quietly. Or for proof. My father's work. Elijah nodded. Both. And they'll escalate if they sense opportunity. The Millers don't make idle moves. Everything is calculated, timed, precise. This is the first warning. For hours, they observed, mapping the movements, noting patterns. By midnight, the figures retreated, leaving no trace beyond the faint impressions in the dirt. Jules exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. The reality settled like a weight. The Millers' reach was immediate, their influence subtle but persistent, and their patience long. They were testing limits, probing for weaknesses, gauging resolve. Elijah joined her, sliding into the chair across from her. You're not imagining it, he said. They want a reaction. They want fear. But they also want compliance. And they underestimate us. Jules closed the journal briefly, her hands steady. Then we don't give them either. No fear. No surrender. We anticipate, we counter, and we move deliberately. We follow my father's guidance, step by step. The night deepened, shadows folding in on themselves. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind, every distant rustle reminded them of the stakes. Yet beneath the tension, a quiet determination emerged. Jules was no longer simply a visitor returning to a childhood home. She was a participant in a larger struggle, a custodian of truth, and a guardian of her father's legacy. By dawn, plans had been made. Watch the edges of the property, document any intrusion, track patterns in town behavior, and prepare for the subtle maneuvers that would follow. They would not react blindly. They would anticipate. The journal provided direction. Vigilance provided protection. Together, they were no longer merely surviving. They were strategizing. Outside, the mountains remained indifferent, silent witnesses to the unfolding conflict. Jules and Elijah, seated in quiet resolve, understood fully. The first true test of courage, intellect, and endurance was only beginning, and the outcome depended entirely on their ability to remain precise, patient, and unyielding. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life on the ranch shifted from cautious observation to deliberate engagement. Jules worked alongside Elijah to repair sections of the old house. The boards and nails connecting more than just walls. They connected two people navigating a fragile trust. Each hammer strike, each measured adjustment was punctuated by conversation, teasing, and subtle laughter that made the tension of recent days momentarily dissolve. One evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, they carried buckets of paint to the barn. The sky glowed orange, streaked with purple, the colors reflected in the calm of a shared silence. Jules glanced at Elijah, noticing how the light caught the edge of his jaw, softened the stern set of his shoulders. For a brief moment, he seemed like someone untouched by the weight of responsibility, a man defined not by law or duty, but by presence and focus. I never imagined I'd enjoy this, Jules admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she applied a fresh coat to a doorframe. Her voice carried no sarcasm, only genuine observation. Elijah chuckled, leaning against the doorway to watch her. Simple tasks have a way of revealing things, he said. They let you see character. Patience, persistence, and maybe, willingness to face challenges together. His tone carried a subtle warmth, a hint of vulnerability. Jules paused, brush in hand, and met his eyes. The air between them shifted, charged with unspoken understanding. The walls around the barn, the fading light, the quiet of the forest, They created a space where past fears could be softened by connection. Over the following days, their partnership deepened. Elijah showed her hidden trails in the surrounding forest, paths her father had once used to monitor the land. They spoke of childhood memories, of regrets, of dreams never realized. Jules found herself laughing more easily, trusting more openly, and sensing that the man beside her was more than a protector. He was a companion, a mirror reflecting her own resilience. Yet even in these moments of quiet intimacy, the shadow of the Millers loomed. Subtle signs persisted: a gate slightly ajar, a fence post shifted overnight, neighbors who glanced away too quickly. Jules could not ignore these signals, and neither did Elijah. But together, they balanced vigilance with vulnerability, fear with trust. Their bond became both shield and anchor. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by a small fire in the clearing behind the barn. The flames flickered, illuminating their faces in alternating light and shadow. Elijah handed her a mug of coffee, warmth seeping into her hands. They sat side by side, the proximity natural, unforced. "You've changed," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Since you arrived, since you decided to face all of this, you're not the same person who left Chicago." Jules smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and weariness. "I had to learn to see clearly," she said, "to understand what my father left behind, to navigate what's here. And I've had a good teacher." Elijah's lips curved in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Then perhaps this place isn't just about survival," he said, glancing around the clearing, "but discovery. Of land, of truth, of each other." For the first time since returning, Jules allowed herself to fully inhabit the moment. The warmth of the fire, the steadiness of Elijah beside her, the knowledge that while danger lingered, trust and connection were possible. They were not merely surviving the Miller's shadow. They were building a space of their own, a quiet resistance rooted in intimacy and strategy. As the stars emerged overhead, pale pinpoints against the dark sky, Jules realized something profound. Courage was not merely confronting threat, but also opening oneself to connection amid uncertainty. And for the first time in years, she felt the fragile but undeniable spark of hope. The morning air was sharp and still when Silas Miller arrived at the edge of Jules' property. His black SUV rolled down the gravel drive, tires kicking up small stones, the engine cutting through the silence of the mountains like a controlled intrusion. He stepped out, impeccably dressed, every movement deliberate, exuding authority masked as civility. Behind him, two aides mirrored his posture, silent shadows moving in perfect synchronization. Jules and Elijah were outside, inspecting repairs to the perimeter fencing. When they noticed the vehicle, Elijah's hand brushed lightly against Jules' shoulder, a subtle warning. "That's him," he murmured. Silas approached, hands folded neatly, his smile measured. "Ms. Harper," he began, his voice smooth, precise, and unsettlingly polite. "It seems your family property has become a point of interest. I understand your father's passing was unfortunate, and I extend my condolences." Jules nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Thank you. I'm managing things here as best I can." He tilted his head slightly, surveying the house and land with a practiced eye. "Indeed, I am sure it is quite the undertaking. However," he paused, letting the word linger, "I would like to present an offer. A financial proposal that is generous, exceeding market value by a considerable margin. Immediate acquisition, no complications." Jules stiffened, suspicion tightening her chest. "And in exchange," she asked, eyes narrowing. Silas's smile remained. "A simple signature on the documents," he said smoothly. "Your father's estate transferred to my family's care. Expedient resolution for all parties." Elijah stepped slightly in front of Jules, positioning himself subtly. "And if she refuses?" he asked evenly, his gaze steady. Silas's eyes flickered, just for a moment, betraying a glint of something darker. "Refusal is unfortunate, but I trust Ms. Harper will act with reason. The town respects pragmatism, after all. Resistance may carry consequences, unintended, perhaps, but real." His words were calm, but the implied threat pressed like a weight in the air. Jules exhaled slowly, weighing the offer. Money meant freedom, but the price was too high. Compliance would erase her father's legacy, surrendering the land and any chance of uncovering the truth. Her gaze shifted to Elijah. His posture conveyed unwavering support, silent counsel to stand firm. "I will not sell," Jules said, her voice steady despite the tension curling in her stomach. "Not for any sum, not under any conditions that betray my father's life and work." Silas's smile did not waver. "I admire conviction," he said, almost sincerely. "Few possess it. But do consider this. Obstinance in the face of opportunity can be costly. The decision is yours, Miss Harper. I merely present the reality." He stepped back toward his vehicle, his aides following, leaving an echo of control behind him. As the SUV disappeared down the winding road, Jules felt a mixture of relief and foreboding. The first direct confrontation had occurred, and the stakes were unmistakable. The Millers were willing to leverage wealth, influence, and subtle intimidation to achieve their aims. Resistance was now not only a matter of principle, but survival. Elijah turned to her, hand brushing hers briefly in reassurance. "This was inevitable," he said quietly. "Offers, threats, tests, they measure what you'll endure, how far you'll go. We know the boundaries now." Jules's gaze returned to the mountains, the land stretching beneath them, wild and untamed. The ranch was more than property. It was a legacy, a map of hidden truths, and a battlefield of wills. And in that clarity, she understood fully. The Miller's civility was a weapon, and any future moves would be calculated, relentless, and dangerous. Together, they returned to the house, the journal open on the table. Each line, each notation, became a guide not only to understanding her father's work, but to anticipating the Miller's next actions. The confrontation had shifted the landscape of power, and Jules realized that the path forward would require strategy, courage, and the kind of precision her father had spent a lifetime cultivating. Late that evening, guided by a cryptic shorthand in the journal's margins, Jules returned to the basement. She bypassed the obvious shelves, focusing instead on the workbench's structural supports. A hard tug on a false brace revealed a light-tight compartment. Inside lay the core of her father's vigilance. 3 encrypted ledgers and a high-frequency radio receiver modified to intercept local encrypted bands. These weren't just observations. They were logs of the Millers' offshore transactions and illegal transit schedules. Elijah appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the stairs. He wasn't just watching them, Jules. He was building a case for a federal seizure, he said, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. She spread the ledgers under the work lamp, the ink vibrant against the aging paper. He didn't die because he was strange, Elijah. He died because he had the exact coordinates of their entire infrastructure. He left me a weapon, not just a house. Elijah stepped closer, reading over her shoulder. His brow furrowed. He documented everything, he said quietly. Every move, every risk. He left a plan, but he also left a warning. Whoever tries to take advantage of this property will escalate. They won't hesitate. Jules nodded, absorbing both pride and fear. The journal was more than evidence. It was a roadmap, a shield, and a call to action. She understood why her father had kept it hidden. Knowledge of the Millers' dealings was dangerous, and anyone who possessed it became a target. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the basement in stark white. Jules lifted her eyes from the journal, glancing at Elijah. "We have to be smart," she said. "This isn't just about selling the land anymore. It's about exposing the truth, protecting the property, and surviving the consequences." Elijah's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Then we proceed carefully," he said. "We use his notes, anticipate their moves, and control what we can. No reaction without strategy. That's how we stay alive and keep the upper hand." The storm outside intensified, rain hammering the roof, wind whistling through cracks in the walls. But within the basement, a sense of purpose settled over them. Jules held the journal close, understanding that her father had left her more than a record of crime. He had left her the tools to fight it, the knowledge to act, and the courage to endure. For the first time since returning, Jules felt a shift. The fear of the unknown began to transform into determination. The Millers' influence was vast, but it was not absolute. And armed with her father's meticulous documentation, she realized she could face the threat not with panic, but with clarity, strategy, and resolve. The next day dawned gray and heavy. the sky a sheet of low clouds pressing down on the mountains. Jules carried the journal to the porch, the wind tugging at her hair and papers, her mind spinning with revelations from the night before. Elijah joined her, a thermos of coffee in hand, eyes scanning the distant tree-line with quiet vigilance. "We need to talk," he said, tone even but carrying a weight that made Jules stiffen. She had anticipated this conversation, yet the uncertainty of what he would reveal made her pulse quicken. Jules opened the journal again, tracing her father's notations. "I know what they've been doing, Elijah. I understand the danger. And I'm not selling. I won't compromise his legacy or the truth." Elijah nodded, but his gaze shifted to the horizon. "I know, and I also know what this means for both of us. The Millers are entrenched in every corner of this town. Their money, their influence, the services they fund, the hospital, the schools, the jobs, they hold the city in their hands. If I try to enforce the law fully, the town suffers. Innocent people suffer. I can't ignore that." Jules felt a chill. The clarity she had gained from the journal collided with reality. Elijah, protector, friend, and now potential obstacle, was bound by loyalty to the community as much as to her. "Then what?" she asked, voice low but firm. "Do we just let them continue? Let them get away with everything?" Elijah ran a hand through his hair, frustration barely contained. "I want to protect you. I want to see justice done. But I can't do it alone, and I can't destroy the town in the process. That's why I wanted you to hear it from me first. I've tried to find a way that avoids direct conflict, but this isn't simple. The Miller's power is woven into everything." Jules' hands tightened around the journal. "So your plan is what? Accept their influence? Pretend nothing's happening while I risk everything?" Her voice cracked slightly, emotion threading through anger, fear, and disbelief. Elijah shook his head, his voice calm but laced with tension. "No, my plan is survival. Yours, if you choose, can be exposure. Evidence, strategy, discretion. You can fight on your terms, not mine. I can help you navigate, but I can't guarantee safety or town approval. If you move against them, you do it fully aware of the cost." Jules swallowed, processing the scope of what he said. The stakes had shifted from principle to strategy, from defiance to negotiation of risk. Every choice carried consequences that extended beyond herself. Yet she felt a fire ignite inside, a refusal to be cowed, to be silenced. "Then I'll do it," she said finally. "I'll expose the truth. And I won't walk away because it's easier. I can't. Not after what I've learned." Elijah gripped the edge of the porch railing, his knuckles white. "If we do this, we aren't just fighting for a house. We're targeting the Miller's logistics, the very things that keep this town's lights on. It's surgical, Jules. One slip, and the backlash won't just hit us. It'll tear the community apart." Jules didn't hesitate, her fingers tightening around the ledger. "The community is already dying under their grip. They just haven't felt the cold yet. We used the coordinates from the map to identify the blind spots in their transit routes. My father didn't just watch. He prepared an intercept." Elijah looked at her, seeing the strategist replace the mourner. "Then we move at midnight when the patrol shifts change. I'll clear the digital logs, but you'll have to be the one on the ground at the ravine. This isn't just a legacy anymore. It's an insurgency." The days that followed were tense, a silent storm of subtle threats and calculated intimidation. One morning, Jules discovered the barn door had been forced open, a section of the fence torn down, and tire tracks leading deep into the forest. The markings were too deliberate to be random. Whoever had come had done so with knowledge of the property, of her routines. Elijah arrived as the smoke still curled from the barn, his jaw set in a hard line. He knelt by the truck, pointing to the severed brake lines and the empty collar by the porch. "They've neutralized your mobility and the perimeter dog," he said, his voice tight. "They're isolating the objective before they move in." Jules didn't look at the ruin. She looked at the tree-line, her hands steady as she retrieved a heavy toolkit from a stone cache beneath the floorboards. "They think they've boxed me in," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "But my father didn't design this house to be a home. He designed it to be a bottleneck. By cutting my exit, Silas just committed his men to a direct assault on a kill zone I've been studying since I was 10. Tell him he didn't trap a victim. He just walked into a 20-year-old ambush. Neighbors, once familiar, now avoided her gaze entirely, whispers following her every movement. Jules realized that fear had spread through the town like a contagion, manipulated by the Miller's reach. Trust, she understood, was fragile here, and the community had been conditioned to prioritize self-preservation over justice. Elijah remained close, his presence both reassuring and strategic. Together, they surveyed the damage, noting patterns, assessing weaknesses, and plotting countermeasures. "They want isolation," he said, his voice low, measured. "They want you to feel alone. But we're not alone, and we'll use every advantage they underestimate." Jules nodded, studying the forest edge where the tracks disappeared. "Every act they take, we record. Every threat is an opportunity to expose them. They think terror controls us, but knowledge is stronger than fear." The nights grew longer, the forest darker, shadows stretching in unnatural angles as if to mock them. Each small act of sabotage was a reminder of the Miller's willingness to escalate. Yet Jules felt a shift inside. The terror no longer paralyzed her. It sharpened her resolve, made her methodical, deliberate. Fear became strategy. By the end of the week, she and Elijah had established patterns of surveillance, documenting each movement, preparing contingencies. They reinforced doors, cleared escape routes, and monitored the forest edges tirelessly. The journal guided them, offering insight into both the land and the Miller's likely tactics. In these days of escalating threats, Jules realized a profound truth. The fight for the property was no longer just about land or legacy. It was about survival, morality, and the capacity to act under relentless pressure. The Miller's intimidation was relentless, but so was her determination to protect what her father had safeguarded. That night, sitting together in the barn, Jules and Elijah shared a silent acknowledgement. The danger had escalated beyond subtle testing. It was now personal. The Millers had shown their willingness to harm, manipulate, and isolate her. But Jules' resolve was unwavering. She would not be driven from the land, nor silenced, nor cowed by terror. The forest around them seemed to watch, indifferent to human struggle, yet within that indifferent space, Jules and Elijah prepared. Every plan, every movement, every breath was calculated. They were no longer reactive. They were ready to act, to anticipate, and to confront the threats head-on. The mountains were a black void when the first infrared beam flickered against the porch. Silas Miller didn't hide. He stood in the center of the driveway, flanked by 4 men in tactical gear. Elijah drew his sidearm, but Jules held up a hand, her eyes on the radio receiver she'd brought from the basement. "You're trespassing on a federal crime scene, Silas," she projected, her voice cutting through the damp air. Silas laughed softly, stepping forward. "A crime scene needs a witness, Miss Harper, and you're currently out of range for any help." He signaled his men to advance, but Jules tapped a command into her tablet. A series of floodlights, hidden years ago by her father, ignited with blinding intensity, pinning the men in a crossfire of white light. Simultaneously, the radio receiver began broadcasting their own encrypted tactical chatter back at them. "I'm not out of range," Jules said, her face illuminated by the glare. "I've been broadcasting your transit logs to the regional field office for the last 10 minutes. Every step you take toward this house is another felony recorded on a federal server." Silas froze, the polite mask finally shattering as he realized the house wasn't the target. He was. "Check the perimeter," he hissed to his men, but the forest was already alive with the distant, rhythmic thrum of approaching rotaries. The leverage had shifted. The Millers were no longer the hunters, but the evidence. Jules sank to a log, heart racing, limbs trembling, but eyes bright with triumph. "They won't underestimate us again," she said, breath uneven. Elijah knelt beside her, voice calm, grounding. "No, and neither will we. This is only the beginning of what we control: planning, preparation, precision. They may return, but we are ready." The journal lay open beside them, a testament to foresight, legacy, and the power of careful observation. The mountains, silent witnesses to the confrontation, seemed almost approving. Jules realized that survival was not just about courage. It was intelligence applied under pressure, anticipation, and the steadfast refusal to yield. Together, they watched the horizon as the first faint hints of dawn touched the treetops. The confrontation was over, but the battle for justice, truth, and protection of the land had just begun. The dawn didn't bring peace, but a cold, clinical clarity. Federal units moved through the property with the same precision her father had once used to map it, securing the ledgers and the radio equipment. Jules stood on the porch, watching the black SUVs line the driveway where Silas Miller had stood hours before. The town remained silent, but the air had changed. The crushing weight of the Millers' influence was being systematically dismantled, file by file. Elijah stood beside her, his badge gleaming in the early light, no longer a symbol of a compromised town, but of a restored law. He didn't speak, but his presence was a steady anchor against the coming storm of depositions and trials. Jules looked down at the empty space where her father's workshop had stood. The physical loss was immense, but the tactical victory was total. The fear that had governed the valley for decades was being replaced by a cautious, shivering hope. She hadn't just saved the land. She had liquidated a criminal empire using the very blueprints her father had died to protect. Elijah and Jules sat on the porch, hands intertwined, exhausted but resolute. "It's over," she said quietly, though the weight of the week still pressed upon her. For now, he echoed, his voice firm. "The Millers won't forget, and neither will the town. But we've survived, and we've preserved what matters most: the truth, the property, and each other." Jules leaned against him, the mountains around them vast, indifferent, yet protective in their own silent way. They had endured not just threats, but the subtle machinery of influence, intimidation, and manipulation. They had acted with precision, strategy, and courage. Their bond, forged under pressure and shared danger, was unbreakable, tempered by fire and clarity. The town slowly began to breathe again, the social and economic cracks laid bare by the conflict now visible. Some called it ruin. Jules saw it as opportunity, a chance for reflection, rebuilding, and perhaps a more honest future. Elijah, standing beside her, embodied both steadfast protection and unwavering commitment. They didn't pack for a retreat, but for a delivery. The truck was heavy with the ledgers, the radio logs, and the hard evidence that linked the Millers' infrastructure to federal violations. As they reached the county line, Elijah pulled over, handing Jules a satellite phone. "The moment we cross, the data upload to the federal task force begins," he said, watching the sunrise hit the valley. "The ranch will be under protection within the hour. We aren't leaving the battlefield. We're just shifting it to a court they can't bribe." Jules looked back at the mountain peaks, no longer a place of shadows, but a monument to her father's long game. "We aren't just free, Elijah," she said, her hand hovering over the send icon. "We're the consequence they never saw coming." They drove forward into the light. The engine's hum, a steady rhythm of justice, finally set in motion, leaving behind a town that was about to wake up to a very different reality.